I'm Brian Yazell. I'm an associate professor in English and American Studies at SDU. I'm also a fellow in the Danish Institute for Advanced Studies, and I am a co-PI of PACA. As a literature scholar, I'm interested in narrative in a more, I think, familiar sense in terms of art and novels and film, and I'm interested in specifically the way speculative narratives circulate in culture and are internalized and repeated by young people in particular in Denmark. So with Leo, I'm working with high school students to write their own speculative stories about climate change in the future and trying to map this alongside the grassroots activists that we're dealing with PACA to see where their speculations overlap and where they might diverge. So at the climate fiction event, Leo and I should say, we're sharing our research in terms of what we've been doing with the high school students and trying to really ground it in a dialogue with the artists, writers, and the teachers who are at that event who deal with climate fiction on a much more, I think, engaged and practical level. And as a literature scholar, my interest in this was to assess the impact of fiction from a different side. So rather than ask them to read a short story or a novel, which we often do, of course, I was curious to see to what extent they've already maybe internalized certain narratives, which of course they have, as we've discussed today. Our research shows that climate fiction is a really effective way of assessing the shared concerns and expectations young people have. But then, of course, we're also interested in understanding how we might be able to prompt them or encourage them to think about more hopeful futures as well. And this is something that I think only comes through with a dialogue with teachers and young people who are obviously the ones we're dealing with.
My name is Leo. I'm a postdoc in PACA, and I work on a project that is called Addressing Climate Anxiety Using Flash Fiction in the Classroom with Brian. I think it's important to work with fiction because the climate crisis is a crisis at many different levels. And many people have said that it's also a crisis of the imagination. So we need to work with fiction to figure out which kind of narratives people have in mind when they think of the future and the climate. Sometimes when you work with books, you have the sense that you're just closed in a room, working on your own, on something that is really not real or like that doesn't have an impact. In PACA, people are all trying to figure out ways to work with the real world also outside of the university. And I think that's why it's such a good place for a project like this, where we work with students, other people in the real world, and that's what is really linking all of our projects, I think.
My name is Ida. And I'm an anthropologist and PhD student in PACA. My colleague Josephine and we did a flash fiction writing workshop on ecofeminism, where we worked with narrative in the way that we tried to make the participants engage in writing small pieces of fiction where they imagine a different world in the way that we asked them to formulate a story as narrated from a different protagonist. So that may be of a different gender than is usually the protagonist or a different species even. So trying to imagine perspectives from other actors than those we usually engage with. Ecofeminism has many different outlets, many different formats. We see it in poetry, we see it in other kinds of literature, in artwork. As you see, Frida is right now in the middle of doing a lino cut artwork based on this workshop. Going to give it a visual expression, what we're going to talk about.
These he sent crawling into wilderness he could not enter, swimming into untamed water. He could hear their voices at night, and tracks and breathing at the fierce edge of forest, where all things know the names for themselves, and no man speaks them or takes away their tongue.
The ecofeminist writing workshop aligned very much with the PACA idea of engaging with multi-species agency by asking participants to imagine how would a more than human perspective look. Then we were trying to encourage people to think more along the lines of multi-species entanglement.